In a forgotten village where survival meant silence, a father's rage became public spectacle. The crack of a whip cutting through morning air, a beautiful daughter kneeling in shame, and a crowd too afraid to intervene. But when a black carriage appeared on that dusty road flanked by royal knights, everything changed. The king himself descended, his eyes locking onto the girl with a recognition that defied explanation, and spoke words that made every witness hold their breath. No father should ever wound what is part of himself. What followed would shatter a kingdom's foundation and expose a secret buried for 18 years, a secret powerful enough to destroy a throne, yet profound enough to redefine what it means to be family. This is a story of two fathers, one daughter, and a truth so dangerous that revealing it could cost everything, but hiding it would cost even more. Because sometimes the most devastating question isn't about what happened in the past. It's about what happens when a single moment of courage forces everyone to choose between convenient lies and impossible truths. The whip cracked through the morning air like a death sentence, each strike tearing not just flesh but the very soul of those who witnessed it. Dawn had barely broken over the village, yet already the square was stained with something far darker than shadow. Shame, disgrace, and a father's fury turned into public spectacle. The peasant's face was carved from stone and bitterness, his calloused hands gripping the leather with the certainty of a man who believed he was doing God's work. His daughter knelt in the dirt, her beauty now a curse that had brought this punishment upon her. She didn't scream. That would have been a mercy. Instead, she wept silently, tears mixing with the dust at her feet, each one a prayer that would never reach heaven. The villagers pressed against their wooden shutters, eyes wide with a hunger that masqueraded as concern. They whispered behind calloused hands, their judgment as sharp as any blade. She spoke to a stranger. They hissed, the words dripping with venom disguised as righteousness, a traveler with coins in his purse and sin in his eyes. But there was something else in their stares, something that made the girl's skin crawl even more than the leather against her back. They looked at her the way wolves look at wounded prey, with pity that barely concealed their relief it wasn't them bleeding in the square. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, thick with the smell of fear sweat and morning dew turning sour. Somewhere, a rooster crowed, oblivious, cruel in its normalcy. The blacksmith's hammer had fallen silent. Even the dogs had stopped their barking, as if nature itself recoiled from what unfolded in that forgotten corner of the kingdom. The girl's fingers dug into the earth, nails breaking against stones, searching for something, anything, to anchor her to a world that suddenly felt like it was spinning away. Then came the sound that changed everything. Not the whip this time, but something far more ominous, the rhythmic thunder of hooves against packed earth, growing louder, closer, impossible to ignore. The peasant's arm froze mid-strike, the leather whip dangling like a serpent that had suddenly lost its venom. Through the settling dust of the road appeared a black carriage, flanked by knights whose armor caught the pale morning sun and threw it back like accusations. No one had seen nobles in this village for years, let alone anyone from the royal court. They were ghosts here, existing only in tax collectors' threats and children's nighttime stories. The crowd's whispers died instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the world had been stripped of sound itself. The peasant's weathered face drained of what little color it had, his eyes widening with a terror that eclipsed even his earlier rage. His hands began to shake, not with anger now, but with the primal understanding that he had been caught doing something that couldn't be undone, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be forgiven. The whip slipped from his fingers and fell into the dirt with a soft thud that somehow sounded like thunder. The carriage door opened with a groan of expensive hinges, and a figure emerged with the deliberate grace of someone who had never known hurry or fear. The king himself, though at first no one could believe it. Kings didn't visit places like this, didn't breathe the same air as people whose names would never be written in any book. Yet there he stood, his dark cloak settling around him like the wings of some great, terrible bird of judgment. But it wasn't his royal bearing that stole every breath in that square. It was his eyes. Those eyes locked onto the girl kneeling in the dirt, and something flickered across his face that no crown could mask. Not anger, as everyone expected. Not disgust at the peasant's brutality, but something infinitely more disturbing: recognition, pain, the kind of anguish that comes from seeing a ghost made flesh, a past that refuses to stay buried, a truth that time couldn't erase. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath skin that had probably never known real hunger or cold, yet somehow looked haunted by both. He moved forward, each step measured, controlled, yet somehow desperate. The knights shifted nervously, hands hovering near sword hilts, confused by their sovereign's behavior. The king bent, actually bent, and his fingers closed around the whip handle, pulling it from the dirt with a gentleness that contradicted everything about the moment. When he stood holding that instrument of torture, his knuckles were white with a fury that seemed directed at the entire world. The peasant stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. Majesty, he managed, the word barely a whisper, barely human. But the king's attention was no longer on him. It was still fixed on the girl, on her tear-stained face, on the way her dark hair fell across shoulders that shook with silent sobs. Something in his expression cracked then, just for a heartbeat, revealing a wound that had never healed. "No, father," the king said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, "should ever wound what is part of himself." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning that no one could quite grasp, but everyone could feel. The peasant's face twisted with confusion that bordered on madness. How could the king know? What did he mean? The girl raised her head slowly, painfully, her eyes meeting the king's for the first time, and in that moment, something passed between them. A recognition that neither wanted, a truth that both feared, a connection that defied every law of kingdom and blood. The king's hand trembled as he held the whip, and for just a second, his royal mask slipped entirely. In its place was something raw, something broken, something that looked terrifyingly like hope mixed with unbearable grief. The morning sun climbed higher, indifferent to the lives it illuminated, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll, each strike counting down to a revelation that would shatter more than just one life. The peasant took another step back, his calloused hands raised as if to ward off demons, his voice cracking when he finally found words. How could your majesty possibly know she is part of me?" The silence that followed the king's words was the kind that suffocates, that presses against eardrums and makes hearts forget their rhythm. Every villager stood frozen, their bodies locked in positions of shock, as if God himself had reached down and paused time just to let the weight of this moment sink into their bones. The king's cloak stirred in a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, and slowly, so slowly it felt like watching a mountain bow, he lowered himself to one knee before the girl. No one had ever seen such a thing. Kings didn't kneel. Kings didn't touch dirt that peasants walked on. Kings certainly didn't gaze at common girls with eyes that held the kind of desperate tenderness usually reserved for prayers whispered in the darkest hours of night. His fine blue cape dragged through the mud, absorbing the filth of the square, but he paid it no more attention than he would to a falling leaf. His focus was absolute, total, terrifying in its intensity. "Your name," he said, and his voice, that voice which had commanded armies and declared wars, now trembled with something that sounded dangerously close to pleading. "Tell me your name, child." The girl's throat worked, trying to form words past the knot of fear and confusion that had lodged there like a stone. Her lips parted, closed, parted again. Around them, the crowd leaned forward imperceptibly, every soul straining to hear what would come next. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper, fragile as spider silk stretched across morning dew. "Ilara," she managed, and the word seemed to hit the king like a physical blow. His entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing beneath the royal vestments. His eyes, those eyes that had been studying her face with an hunger that wasn't quite recognition but something more painful, more ancient, suddenly widened. A sound escaped his throat, something between a gasp and a sob, quickly swallowed back down where such vulnerable things belonged in men who wore crowns. But not before everyone heard it. Not before the truth of his emotion painted itself across his face in colors too vivid to be mistaken or forgotten. There was something in the way he looked at her now, something that made the peasant's stomach twist with a dread he couldn't name. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost, yes, but more than that. It was the look of someone finding something precious they thought they'd lost forever, only to discover it in the last place they'd ever think to search. The king's hand lifted, trembling, as if he might touch her face, then stopped midair, hovering there like a question that couldn't be asked. Behind him, the royal knights shifted their weight from foot to foot, hands gripping sword hilts with the nervous energy of men who understood that something was happening beyond their comprehension, beyond their ability to control. One of them, a young soldier with a scar across his jaw, exchanged a glance with his companion that spoke volumes of confusion and concern. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't anything that had ever been written in any book of royal conduct. The peasant found his voice, though it came out strangled, desperate, the sound of a man watching his entire world tilt sideways. She brought shame to our house, Your Majesty," he stammered, wringing his hands like he was trying to squeeze water from stones. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill, trickling down temples that had probably never known such fear. She was seen speaking to a stranger, a traveler with intentions that... Silence. The word cut through the air like an executioner's blade, sharp and final. The king didn't even turn to look at the peasant when he spoke. His gaze remained locked on Alara, drinking in every detail of her face, as if trying to memorize something he'd been forced to forget. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, but underneath it ran a current of something else, something that sounded like barely contained anguish. "Shame," he said slowly, deliberately, letting each syllable land like a stone in still water, "does not come from the purity of one's heart, but from the cruelty of others' eyes." The words rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Women who had been clutching their shawls in judgment now loosened their grip. Men who had nodded approvingly at the punishment now found themselves studying their own feet with sudden interest. The king's pronouncement wasn't just a statement, it was an indictment, a mirror held up to every person who had gathered to watch a girl be broken in the town square for the crime of being beautiful and speaking to a stranger. The king rose to his feet with fluid grace, though his knees betrayed the slightest tremor, the only sign that this act of humility had cost him something. He turned then, finally, to face his knights. His jaw was set, his eyes hard with the kind of decision that couldn't be unmade. When he spoke, his voice carried across the square with the force of law being written in real time. "This girl will be taken to the castle under my personal protection." The words fell like hammer blows. "She will want for nothing. She will be treated with the respect due to..." He caught himself, the pause so brief most would have missed it, but it was there, heavy with unspoken truth. "Due to any person of worth in my kingdom." The peasant's face went from pale to completely bloodless. He lurched forward, falling to his knees with a sound that was half sob, half scream. His hands clawed at the dirt, reaching toward the king, toward his daughter, toward a future that was being ripped away from him like flesh from bone. "No, please, Majesty, please, she is all I have. She is mine. You cannot..." But the king's expression had already closed, becoming once again the impassive mask of royalty. He looked down at the peasant with something that might have been pity, might have been contempt, or might have been the most terrible kind of understanding. The knowledge that comes from having caused someone else the exact pain you yourself have endured. "Everything precious," the king said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost kind, which somehow made it more terrible, "must be protected, even when its keeper does not know its true value." He gestured to his knights, who moved forward with practiced efficiency, their armor clanking in the heavy silence. One of them, the older captain with gray threading through his beard, helped Alara to her feet with surprising gentleness. She swayed, dizzy from shock and emotion and the sudden reversal of her entire existence. The captain's hand steadied her elbow, and he murmured something too low for others to hear, some word of reassurance that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what was happening. As they guided her toward the black carriage, Alara turned back once, her eyes finding the peasant who had raised her, who had just moments ago been striking her with leather and rage. His face was pressed into the dirt now, his shoulders heaving with sobs that sounded like they were tearing him apart from the inside. She wanted to say something, to explain that she didn't understand any of this either, but no words came. Only tears, hot and bitter, streaming down cheeks that still burned from the morning's humiliation. The king moved toward the carriage with measured steps, his hand reaching into the pocket of his vest with absent-minded habit, perhaps seeking some small comfort, some talisman to ground him in reality. But as his fingers emerged, something small and golden tumbled free, catching the sunlight as it fell. It hit the ground with a soft ping, rolling twice before settling in the dirt directly between the carriage and where the peasant still knelt. A ring, golden and intricately carved, bearing the unmistakable symbol of a moon, intertwined with a crown. The same design, the exact same symbol, that hung on a tarnished chain around Alara's neck, hidden beneath the rough fabric of her peasant dress. The same symbol she had worn since she was old enough to remember. The only beautiful thing she had ever owned. The only mystery in her simple life. The peasant's sobs cut off abruptly. His head lifted, eyes fixing on that golden ring with the expression of a man who had just seen the gates of hell open before him. His mouth formed words that wouldn't come, questions that couldn't be asked, accusations that died on lips that had lost all moisture. Around them, those villagers close enough to see the ring began to murmur. A low sound like distant thunder, like the first warning of a storm that would change everything. The king's hand froze halfway to the carriage door. He had felt the ring slip from his pocket, had heard it fall, and now stood completely still. A statue carved from flesh and dread, and something that looked terrifyingly like recognition of fate's cruel hand. He didn't turn, didn't bend to retrieve it, didn't acknowledge its existence, but his shoulders tensed in a way that spoke of desperate control, of secrets balanced on the edge of a knife, of truths that once spoken could never be unspoken. Alara's hand moved instinctively to her throat, to the chain hidden there, to the twin of what now lay gleaming in the mud. Her fingers closed around it through the fabric, and her breath caught with the sharp pain of understanding beginning to dawn. Terrible, impossible understanding. The castle walls rose before Alara like the bones of some ancient giant, gray and impossibly tall, blocking out the sky itself. She had seen them from a distance all her life, a smudge on the horizon, a reminder of power that existed in a world completely separate from her own. Now she walked through gates that groaned open like the mouth of a beast, swallowing her whole into a life she couldn't begin to comprehend. The courtyard alone was larger than her entire village, paved with stones so smooth they seemed to mock the rough dirt paths she'd known since birth. Servants moved like shadows through corridors lit by torches that never seemed to dim, their faces carefully blank as they passed the peasant girl who suddenly occupied rooms meant for nobility. They didn't speak to her directly, that would have violated some unspoken hierarchy, but their eyes said everything their mouths wouldn't dare. Curiosity, suspicion, the kind of calculating assessment that made Alara's skin crawl worse than any physical touch. She was a puzzle piece that didn't fit, and everyone knew it, except no one understood why the king had forced her into the picture anyway. The bed she slept in was obscene in its softness, sheets made of linen so fine it felt like sleeping on clouds that might dissolve beneath her weight. The first night she'd lain awake until dawn, too terrified to move, convinced that if she shifted wrong, she'd somehow break something and be cast back out into the world she'd left behind. Food arrived on silver plates, actual silver, the kind of metal she'd only ever seen in the hands of tax collectors, and she'd stared at it for a full hour before daring to eat, half convinced it was some kind of test, some trap she couldn't identify. But the luxury wasn't comfort. It was a prison made of silk and plenty, and the bars were made of questions that had no answers. Why had the king brought her here? What did he see when he looked at her with those eyes that held too much pain, too much recognition? And why did his presence make her heart race with something that felt dangerously close to familiarity, like remembering a dream she'd never actually had? The king himself was a ghost in her new existence. She'd catch glimpses of him in corridors, always at a distance, always surrounded by advisors whose faces were sharp with political calculation. Once, their eyes met across the length of the great hall, and the look he gave her was so raw, so desperate, that she'd had to grip the wall to keep from stumbling. Then he'd turned away, disappearing into shadows and responsibilities, leaving her drowning in confusion that grew thicker with each passing day. It was on the fifth night, or maybe the sixth, time had become strange and fluid in this place, that Alara found herself assigned to light the fires in the lesser-used chambers. Work, the head servant had said with a sniff of disapproval, would be good for her. Keep her hands busy, stop her from getting ideas above her station, though of course the woman hadn't said that last part aloud. Didn't need to. It hung in the air like smoke. The fireplace in the west corridor was particularly stubborn, the wood damp from recent rains that seeped through stone older than memory. Alara knelt before it, coaxing flame from tinder, when voices drifted through the wall, low, conspiratorial, the kind of whispers that weren't meant to be heard but somehow carried anyway. She froze, every muscle in her body going still, her breath catching in her throat as the words filtered through the ancient stone, saying the king's been different since he brought her here. The first voice was male, probably one of the stable hands based on the rough accent. Walking the halls at night like a man haunted. Course he is. This voice was female, older, with the knowing tone of someone who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. You know the story, don't you? About the daughter he had years ago, before he was even crowned proper. Ilara's hands went completely numb. The flint slipped from her fingers, clattering against the stone hearth with a sound that seemed impossibly loud, but the voices continued, oblivious to her presence just feet away. Thought that was just castle gossip, rumors to pass the time. Rumors built on truth, boy. The girl disappeared before she could be acknowledged. Some say she died, others say she was sent away, hidden because a bastard daughter would have complicated his claim to the throne. A pause, heavy with meaning. But what if she wasn't dead? What if someone just wanted everyone to think she was? The silence that followed was suffocating. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack bone. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, to the chain she always wore hidden beneath her dress, to the medallion that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The moon intertwined with a crown, the same symbol that had fallen from the king's pocket. The same design she'd carried against her skin for as long as she could remember, never questioning where it came from, never thinking to ask the peasant who raised her why a girl of her station would possess something so clearly valuable. Her fingers trembled as they traced the familiar grooves of the symbol through the fabric. She'd always told herself it was just a trinket, something pretty that someone had taken pity on her and given her mother before she died. Died giving birth, they'd said. Though now even that story felt suspect. Felt like one more lie in a life apparently built on deception. The servants' voices faded as they moved away, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. But Alara couldn't move. Her legs had forgotten how to work. Her lungs had forgotten how to draw breath properly. The implications crashed over her in waves, each one pulling her further from the shore of everything she'd ever believed about herself. If the story was true, if the king had a daughter who disappeared, if that daughter bore some mark, some symbol that would identify her. No, it was impossible, insane. She was a peasant, the child of a farmer and a woman who'd died too young. She'd spent her entire life with dirt under her fingernails and hunger in her belly. Kings didn't have daughters who grew up not knowing who they were. That wasn't how the world worked. But then why had the king looked at her like he was seeing a resurrection? Why had he knelt in the dirt for her? Why had his voice broken when she spoke her name? And why, God, why, did she feel this strange, terrible pull toward him? This sense of connection that made no logical sense but felt true anyway, felt real in a way that logic couldn't touch. The fire had gone out. She'd been kneeling there so long the wood had given up trying to catch. Alara forced herself to stand, her legs shaking, and made a decision that felt both inevitable and catastrophic. She would find the king. She would demand answers. She would look him in the eye and ask the question that was burning through her more fiercely than any flame ever could. The castle at night was a labyrinth of shadows and whispered secrets. Alara moved through it like a ghost herself, following instinct more than knowledge, her feet carrying her toward the royal quarters with a certainty she couldn't explain. Guards should have stopped her, should have questioned what a peasant girl was doing wandering these corridors after dark. But they looked away, Or perhaps they'd been ordered to look away. Or perhaps fate itself was clearing her path toward a confrontation that had been brewing since the moment the king first laid eyes on her in that dusty village square. His door was open. Just slightly. Just enough. Warm light spilled through the gap, and through it she could see him. The king, the man who commanded thousands. The sovereign who'd knelt in mud for reasons she still couldn't fathom. He stood with his back to the door, shoulders hunched in a way that made him look smaller, more human, more breakable than any king should ever appear. In his hands, he held something small and golden, turning it over and over with the obsessive focus of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. The ring, the one he'd dropped. He must have sent someone back to retrieve it. Ilara's hand moved to the door, pushing it open wider. The hinges creaked. A soft sound, but in the heavy silence of the room, it might as well have been a scream. The king spun, and when his eyes met hers, all the masks fell away. Raw grief, desperate hope, fear that looked like it had been living in his chest for years, growing thorns that pierced him with every breath. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, stronger than the trembling in her hands. She stepped into the room uninvited, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. "The medallion I wear around my neck, the moon and the crown." Her fingers found the chain, pulled it free from beneath her dress, let it hang visible between them like an accusation. "Why does it match the symbol on your ring?" The king's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The ring slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor and rolling in a lazy circle before settling at his feet. For a long moment, he just stared at her, at the medallion catching firelight and throwing it back in golden flashes, and she watched as something inside him crumbled, some final defense giving way under the weight of truth that couldn't be denied any longer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, rough with emotion that kings weren't supposed to show, broken with pain that crowns couldn't protect against. "Because," he said, and tears, actual tears, began sliding down his face, carving tracks through the careful composure of royalty. "Because I was the one who gave it to you." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, thick and suffocating and impossible to escape. Ilara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, felt the walls of the room press inward, felt every certainty she'd ever held about her own existence crack and splinter like ice under a hammer. The king, this man, this stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger at all, stood before her with tears streaming down his face, and the sight was so wrong, so fundamentally against the natural order of things, that her mind struggled to accept it as real. He moved then, slowly, as if afraid any sudden motion would shatter whatever fragile moment held them suspended. His hand gestured toward a chair, ornate, carved from dark wood, the kind of furniture that cost more than her village earned in a year. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse, scraped raw by emotion. "Sit. This story, it cannot be told standing." But Ilara couldn't move. Her legs had turned to stone, rooted to the spot where years of lies were dissolving into terrible truth. Her hand clutched the medallion so tightly the edges bit into her palm, creating small crescents of pain that were the only things keeping her tethered to reality. "Tell me," she whispered, and it wasn't a request. It was a demand born from a lifetime of not knowing, from 18 years of being someone without ever understanding who that someone actually was. The king lowered himself into the chair instead, and the movement was that of an old man, someone carrying decades more weight than his actual years. He braced his elbows on his knees, his face falling into his hands for a long moment before he looked up at her with eyes that held so much regret it was almost a physical presence in the room. "Before I was king," he began, each word seeming to cost him something precious. "When I was nothing more than a prince being groomed for a throne I wasn't sure I wanted, I used to escape, ride beyond the castle walls, beyond the reach of advisors and expectations and the suffocating weight of destiny." His lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so full of pain. "That's how I met her. Your mother." The room spun. Ilara reached out blindly, her hand finding the back of a chair, gripping it with white knuckles just to keep from collapsing. Her mother. The woman who died giving birth to her, or so she'd been told. The woman who was nothing but a ghost, a name whispered occasionally by the peasant who'd raised her, always followed by a quick sign of the cross and a change of subject. She was beautiful, the king continued, his gaze distant now, focused on memories that clearly still had the power to wound. Not in the way court ladies are beautiful, all painted and practiced. She was real. She laughed like she meant it. She asked me questions no one at court would dare ask. She didn't care that I was a prince. She cared that I was a person. His voice cracked. I loved her. God help me. I loved her more than I'd ever loved anything. Then why? Ilara's voice broke, the question dying in her throat before she could finish it. But she didn't need to. The answer was written in every line of the king's face, in the defeat that rounded his shoulders, in the tears that wouldn't stop falling. Because love isn't enough when you're born to wear a crown. The bitterness in his words could have stripped paint. When she told me she was pregnant, I was overjoyed. Terrified, but overjoyed. I wanted to marry her, consequences be damned. But the advisors, his hands clenched into fists, they said it would destroy my claim to the throne, that the nobles would never accept a common-born queen, that our child would be seen as a stain, a weakness to be exploited by our enemies. So you abandoned her. The accusation came out flat, emotionless, but underneath it was a fury Ilara hadn't known she was capable of feeling. You let her die alone. No! The king surged to his feet, the sudden movement making Ilara flinch backward. But he caught himself, forced himself still, his whole body trembling with the effort of containing emotions too large for any single person to hold. No, he repeated, quieter now, broken. I sent her away, yes. To your village, with gold enough to live comfortably. I sent my most trusted servant to watch over her, to ensure she wanted for nothing. His breath hitched. But when the time came, when you were born, there were complications. The servant sent word that she was dying, that she was asking for me, but I was being crowned that very day. By the time I could break away, by the time I could reach her, he stopped, unable to continue, the memory clearly too painful to put into words. But Ilara could imagine it, could see it playing out like a nightmare she'd lived without knowing, a young mother bleeding out in a stranger's home, calling for a love who would arrive too late, holding a baby who would never remember her face. She made me promise, the king whispered, his eyes squeezed shut against the image. With her last breaths, she made me swear that I would keep you safe, that I wouldn't let the court destroy you the way they'd destroyed our love. She wanted you to have a chance at a real life, away from the poison of politics and power. He opened his eyes, and they were pleading now, desperate for understanding. So I gave you to a farmer, a man my servant said was honest, kind. I gave him gold to care for you. And I gave you that medallion, the only proof of who you really were, thinking that one day, when it was safe, when I had secured my throne enough that no one could challenge your legitimacy, I would come back for you. But you never did. The words came out as a statement of fact, devoid of accusation, but somehow more damning because of it. I tried. The king's voice was raw, shredded. God, I tried. But there was always another crisis, another threat to the kingdom, another reason why revealing you would put you in danger. And as the years passed, it became easier to tell myself you were better off without me, that you were happy in your simple life, that you didn't need a father who was a king, you needed a father who could actually be present. His laugh was hollow, self-mocking. I convinced myself I was protecting you by staying away, but I was really just protecting myself from the guilt of choosing duty over love. Ilara felt something cold and hard forming in her chest, crystallizing around her heart like ice. The man who raised me, her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. Did he know? Did he know who I really was? The king shook his head slowly, heavily. No. My servant was instructed to tell him only that you were an orphan in need of a home, and that he would be compensated for his trouble. The medallion, I insisted you keep it but disguised its significance. Told the servant to say it was your mother's, a simple trinket with sentimental value, nothing more. He paused, something like shame flickering across his features. I never imagined he would treat you cruelly. The reports I received said you were being cared for, that you were healthy, that... Reports? The word exploded from Alara like a curse. You had someone watching me? All these years you had someone sending you reports telling you I was fine and you never once thought to come yourself? To see with your own eyes how the man you'd paid to care for me treated his unwanted burden? The king flinched as if she'd struck him, which in a way she had. Truth was its own kind of violence. You're right, he said simply, the fight draining out of him. You're absolutely right. I was a coward. I chose the easy path, the path that let me sleep at night by telling myself I was doing what was best for you, when really I was just doing what was easiest for me. Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. Alara's mind was a chaos of emotions too tangled to separate. Rage at the years lost, grief for the mother she'd never known, confusion about who she actually was now, that every truth she'd built her identity on had been revealed as a lie. And underneath it all, a terrible, unwanted ache of sympathy for the broken man before her. This king who'd sacrificed love for duty and was clearly still paying the price. So what now? She finally asked, her voice small, exhausted. Now that you've found me again, now that the secret is out, what happens to me? But before the king could answer, the door burst open with a violence that made them both spin around. A man stood in the doorway, tall, thin, dressed in the elaborate robes of a high-ranking advisor. His face was sharp with intelligence and calculation, his eyes moving between the king and Alara with the rapid assessment of someone piecing together a puzzle he very much wished remained unsolved. Your Majesty, the advisor said, his voice smooth as oil and just as slippery. Forgive the intrusion, but when I heard you were entertaining visitors at this late hour, I felt compelled to ensure all was well. His gaze lingered on Alara, taking in the medallion still visible against her chest, and something like triumph flickered in his eyes. I trust this conversation is nothing that might concern the stability of the realm. The king's face hardened into the mask of royalty Alara had seen him wear in public, cold, impenetrable, powerful. But she could see the fear underneath it now, could read the tension in his shoulders, could recognize the desperate calculation happening behind his eyes as he tried to figure out how much the advisor had overheard, how much damage had already been done. Advisor Corbin, the king said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of a man navigating a minefield. This girl is under my personal protection. That is all you need concern yourself with. But Corbin's smile widened, sharp as a blade. Of course, Your Majesty. Although I must counsel you, secrets have a way of spreading in castle walls, especially secrets that might threaten the very foundation of the crown. He let the words hang there, the threat barely veiled. If this information were to become public knowledge, if the court were to learn that you've been hiding a bastard daughter all these years, well, there are those who might question your fitness to rule, who might suggest that a king who deceives his own people cannot be trusted with their fate. The air in the room turned glacial. The king took a step forward, and for the first time, Alara saw the true power he wielded. Not the power of the crown, but the power of a man who'd spent years learning to survive in a world of vipers and had developed fangs of his own. Are you threatening me, Corbin? The words were soft, dangerous, the verbal equivalent of a sword being slowly drawn from its sheath. Merely advising, Your Majesty. Corbin's smile never wavered. After all, that is my role, to ensure the stability and security of the throne. His eyes slid back to Alara, and in them she saw something that made her blood run cold. And sometimes that stability requires difficult choices. The implication was clear. The threat wasn't just to the king's reputation, it was to her life. Alara's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, suddenly aware of how fragile the human neck was, how easily it could be broken, how simple it would be for someone to arrange an accident, a disappearance, a tragedy that would solve all of the crown's problems at once. The king understood it too. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the fury and helplessness warring in his eyes. He'd spent 18 years trying to protect her by keeping her hidden, and in one night, that protection had shattered, leaving her exposed to dangers he couldn't simply command away. If the throne falls, Corbin said softly, turning to leave, pausing at the doorway to deliver his final blow. Who knows what chaos might follow? How many innocent lives might be lost in the struggle for power? He glanced back over his shoulder. Something to consider, Your Majesty, before you decide how much truth the world needs to hear. And then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt like the moment before an execution, when the blade is raised and everyone holds their breath, waiting for the fall. The days that followed Advisor Corbin's veiled threat moved like honey dripping from a spoon, slow, thick, heavy with a sweetness that had somehow turned poisonous. The castle, which had seemed merely foreign to Alara before, now felt actively hostile. Every shadow held potential danger. Every whisper in the corridors might be about her. Every servant who passed with downcast eyes might be counting the days until her existence became too inconvenient for the crown to tolerate. She could feel the weight of eyes on her constantly now. Not just curious anymore, but calculating, assessing. The kitchen maids who brought her meals lingered a fraction too long in doorways, their gazes sliding over her like hands searching for weaknesses. Guards who'd previously looked through her as if she were invisible now tracked her movements with an attention that felt more like surveillance than protection. Even the stones beneath her feet seemed to whisper warnings she couldn't quite make out, ancient voices telling her to run while she still had legs that could carry her. The castle had become a labyrinth of whispers, each one weaving threads of her story, or what people imagined her story to be, into a tapestry of gossip that spread like wildfire through dry brush. She heard fragments as she passed. The girl the king brought from nowhere looks at her like she's precious as gold, keeping her in rooms meant for nobility. But who is she really? The questions multiplied like rats in darkness, breeding faster than truth could kill them. But worse than the scrutiny, worse than the whispers, was the isolation. The king had withdrawn into his duties with the desperate focus of a man trying to solve an impossible equation. She'd see him in the great hall, surrounded by nobles and advisors, his face a mask of regal composure that she now recognized as a prison he'd built from duty and fear. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the distance, and in those brief moments she'd see the father beneath the crown, tortured, conflicted, drowning in choices that had no right answers. Then someone would speak to him, demand his attention, and he'd turn away, and she'd be alone again in a castle full of people. On the 7th night, or maybe the 8th, she'd lost track of time in this place where days blurred together like watercolors in rain. Alara found herself walking the eastern battlements, unable to sleep, unable to breathe in the suffocating luxury of her chambers. The night air was cold enough to sting, sharp enough to remind her she was still alive, still real, despite feeling like she was slowly dissolving into someone else's nightmare. That's when she saw him. Not the king, but someone unexpected. A figure standing in the shadows of an alcove, distinctive even in darkness. Old Gregory, one of the few servants who'd shown her anything resembling kindness in this place. He'd been a fixture in the castle for longer than most could remember. His face weathered like old leather, his hands gnarled from decades of service. When he caught sight of her, something flickered across his features, recognition mixed with something that looked disturbingly like grief. "You shouldn't be out here alone, miss," he said quietly, his voice rough as gravel. "Not anymore. Not with the way things are now. Are you warning me?" Alara moved closer, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "Or threatening me?" "Warning." He said it without hesitation, with a conviction that somehow made it more frightening. "There's talk in the servant quarters, bad talk, about how some problems solve themselves if left in the right kind of darkness." His eyes met hers, and she saw fear there, not for himself, but for her. "I've served this crown for 43 years, miss. Seen 3 kings come and go. And I'll tell you something true. Secrets in castles are like poison in wine. Sooner or later, someone's going to drink." Before Alara could respond, before she could even process what he was telling her, the sound of boots on stone echoed through the courtyard below. Both of them moved instinctively deeper into shadow, and from their vantage point, they could see 2 figures emerging into the moonlight. One was Advisor Corbin, his angular frame unmistakable even at a distance. The other was a noble Ilara didn't recognize, younger, with the kind of hungry expression men get when they smell opportunity mixed with chaos. Their voices drifted up, fragments of conversation carrying on the wind. Cannot let sentiment destroy what's been built. The girl is a liability. King's judgment has been compromised. If she were to simply disappear. The words hit Ilara like physical blows, each one confirming her worst fears, each one proof that the danger wasn't just theoretical anymore. Gregory's hand gripped her arm, urgent. You need to tell the king. Now. Tonight. But even as he said it, they both knew the terrible truth. The king already knew. How could he not? He'd lived in this world of political machination his entire life. He understood the game better than anyone. And yet he was paralyzed by it, trapped between his love for a daughter he'd just found and his duty to a kingdom that couldn't afford the scandal she represented. The question wasn't whether he knew she was in danger. The question was whether he could bring himself to act in time to save her. Meanwhile, in a part of the castle Ilara had never seen, a small tavern on the edge of the royal district where common folk were occasionally permitted to drink if they kept their voices low and their opinions quieter, the peasant sat hunched over a cup of ale he hadn't touched. His name was Thomas, though few remembered it anymore. He'd become simply the farmer, or that man from the village, his identity consumed by the singular role he'd played in someone else's story. His hands shook as they gripped the cup, knuckles white with tension that had nothing to do with cold. The journey to the castle had taken everything he had, every coin saved over 18 years, every ounce of pride swallowed to beg rides from merchants who looked at him with the contempt reserved for desperate men. But he'd made it. He was here. And tomorrow, he would demand an audience with the king, would throw himself at the feet of power and beg for the return of the girl he'd raised, the daughter who wasn't his by blood but had become his through every sleepless night spent worrying about her future, every meal he'd skipped so she could eat, every dream he'd sacrificed so she might have better. Guilt gnawed at him like rats at a corpse. The memory of the whip in his hands, the sound it made cutting through air before biting into flesh he was supposed to protect. It played on an endless loop in his mind, a torture more effective than any physical punishment. He told himself he was teaching her virtue, protecting her reputation, doing what any father would do in a world that judged women by impossible standards. But the truth he couldn't escape was simpler and more damning. He'd been afraid of what people would say, afraid of losing control, afraid that if he didn't hurt her first, the world would hurt her worse. And now she was gone, taken by a king for reasons Thomas didn't understand, swallowed by a world of stone and power where a simple farmer had no voice, no rights, no claim to a child who'd never really been his in the first place. The not knowing was agony. Was she safe? Was she happy? Did she hate him? The questions circled like vultures, waiting to feast on whatever remained of his sanity. You look like a man wrestling with demons. The voice came from beside him, an older man, face lined with experience and eyes sharp with the kind of knowing that comes from surviving what should have killed you. Word of advice from someone who's been where you are. Demons always win if you fight them alone. Thomas barely glanced at him. I don't need advice. I need my daughter back. The girl the king took? The stranger's eyebrows rose. Whole castle's talking about her. The mysterious peasant child he's protecting like she's made of glass and starlight. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. You want to know the real question everyone's asking? Why? Why would a king risk his reputation, his political standing, his entire legacy for some random farmer's daughter? He paused, letting the implication sink in. Unless she's not random at all. Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes meeting the stranger's. What are you saying? But the man just shrugged, pushed back from the table. I'm saying castles are full of secrets, friend. And sometimes the biggest secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight. He dropped a coin on the table, payment for the ale Thomas hadn't drunk, and walked away, leaving behind questions that felt more dangerous than answers. Back in the castle, the king sat in his private study, a letter clutched in his hands with enough force to crumple the expensive parchment. It was from a neighboring kingdom, an old ally whose support he desperately needed in upcoming treaty negotiations. The message was simple, direct, and devastating. Rumors of the king harboring an illegitimate daughter had reached foreign courts. If these rumors proved true, if scandal engulfed the throne, alliances would be reconsidered. Support would be withdrawn. The delicate political balance that kept the kingdom safe from invasion would collapse like a house of cards in a windstorm. He'd read the letter 17 times, each reading making his chest tighter, his breath shorter, his thoughts more chaotic. The weight of crown and conscience pressed down on him with equal force, threatening to crush whatever was left of the man he'd been before duty had devoured his soul. Every choice led to tragedy. Acknowledge Alara publicly, and watch his kingdom potentially crumble under political pressure and civil unrest. Keep her hidden, and watch her live in constant danger from those who saw her as a threat to be eliminated. Send her away, back to safety and anonymity, and lose her forever, a second abandonment that would destroy whatever remained of his fractured heart. A knock at the door pulled him from his spiral. "Enter," he said, his voice automatically assuming the tone of command even as everything inside him screamed. The door opened to reveal his oldest friend, Lord Marcus, one of the few nobles he'd trusted since childhood, one of the even fewer who'd earned that trust through decades of unwavering loyalty. But the expression on Marcus's face wasn't comforting. It was the look of a man bringing news that would hurt, and knowing there was no way to soften the blow. "The peasant who raised her," Marcus said without preamble. "He's here, traveled 3 days to reach the castle. He's demanding," he caught himself, "requesting an audience with you. Says he won't leave until he sees the girl." A pause. "The guards want to turn him away, but he's causing enough of a scene that people are starting to gather, starting to ask questions about why a simple farmer would be so desperate to speak with the king." The letter slipped from the king's fingers, falling to the desk like a death sentence delivered in writing. The walls were closing in. Time was running out. Every moment he hesitated, every second he spent trying to find a solution that would save everyone, brought them all closer to a disaster that would spare no one. "Bring him to me," the king said finally, the words feeling like surrender. "Tomorrow, at dawn, in the throne room," his voice hardened, "and summon the entire court, every noble, every advisor, every person of rank and standing." Marcus's eyes widened with understanding and horror. "Your Majesty, if you're planning what I think—" "Sometimes," the king interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that couldn't be unmade. "The only way to disarm a weapon is to let it explode in a place where you control the damage." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked his kingdom. All the people depending on him to be strong, to be wise, to be something more than the broken man he'd become. "Send word to Alara as well. Tell her to prepare herself." "Tell her," his voice cracked, and he had to force the next words out. "Tell her that tomorrow the truth becomes public, and whatever happens after that, we face together." As Marcus left to carry out the orders, Advisor Corbin stepped from the shadows of a side corridor where he'd been listening to every word. His smile was the kind that belonged on predators, on creatures that fed on weakness and thrived in chaos. He'd been outmaneuvered, true. The king had found a way to reveal the truth on his own terms, rather than having it weaponized against him. But Corbin had survived in the world of court politics by understanding one fundamental principle. Truth was only dangerous if you couldn't control how people interpreted it. And he had until dawn to make sure that when the revelation came, when the king admitted to hiding a bastard daughter for 18 years, the court would hear not a story of love and sacrifice, but a tale of deception and weakness. A narrative of a king who'd lied to his people, who'd compromised his throne for sentiment, who'd proven himself unfit to rule. The game wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Dawn broke over the castle like a wound opening, the sky bleeding red and gold across stones that had witnessed 1,000 betrayals and would witness one more today. The throne room filled before the sun fully rose, nobles arriving in their finest silks and velvets, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of polite curiosity that barely concealed the predatory hunger beneath. They could smell blood in the water. They'd heard the whispers, caught the fragments of rumor that something unprecedented was about to unfold. and they gathered like carrion birds circling something dying, eager to pick the bones clean. Elara stood in a side chamber, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to keep them still. A servant had dressed her in a gown of deep blue, simple compared to what the noble ladies wore, but finer than anything she'd ever touched in her previous life. The fabric felt like a costume, like she was playing at being someone she wasn't, which she supposed was both true and a lie at the same time. She was wearing clothes that didn't belong to her, preparing to step into an identity she'd been denied for 18 years, about to become both more and less than she'd ever imagined. Through the partially open door, she could see them gathering, the court in all its terrible glory. Women with jewels at their throats worth more than entire villages, their eyes sharp with calculation behind painted faces. Men with swords at their hips that had probably never tasted real battle, their hands soft from lives spent manipulating words instead of plows. These were the people who would judge her, who would decide whether she deserved to exist in their world or whether she was simply an inconvenient mistake that needed to be erased from history. The throne room doors groaned open, and a hush fell like an executioner's blade. Through the crack, Elara watched as Thomas was led in by guards. Her father, who wasn't her father, the man who'd raised her with rough hands and rougher words, but had still been the only parent she'd known. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the grandeur surrounding him, his farmer's clothes marking him as an outsider in a way that made several nobles wrinkle their noses in distaste. But his spine was straight, his jaw set with the stubborn dignity of a man who'd worked soil his entire life and knew the value of standing firm when the ground shifted beneath you. Behind him came the king, and the transformation was complete. This wasn't the broken man who'd wept in private chambers, confessing sins to a daughter who shouldn't exist. This was the sovereign, the ruler, power incarnate wrapped in royal vestments. But Elara could see the cracks now, could read the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the arms of his throne just a fraction too tightly, the barely perceptible tremor in his jaw that spoke of a man walking toward his own execution and trying to do it with dignity. Advisor Corbin stood to the king's right, his face a study in carefully neutral concern, but his eyes gleamed with something that made Elara's stomach turn. Anticipation, satisfaction. The look of a man who'd set a trap and was watching his prey walk willingly into it. Thomas of Millbrook. The king's voice rang out, formal, distant, the voice of judgment and authority. You have demanded audience with your sovereign. Speak your purpose. Thomas's throat worked, his weathered face flushing with emotion. When he spoke, his voice cracked but held. Your Majesty, I come to beg for the return of my daughter, the girl you took from my village. She is all I have in this world, and His voice broke completely. I wronged her, shamed her when I should have protected her. But she is mine to care for, mine to make amends to, and I'm begging you, as one father to another, to let me take her home. The words hung in the air, and Elara felt her heart crack. Despite everything, despite the whip, despite the public humiliation, despite years of being treated like a burden rather than a blessing, there was love in his voice. Desperate, flawed, insufficient love, but love nonetheless. The kind that came from a man who'd never been taught how to express it properly, who'd tried to show care through provision rather than affection, who was only now realizing that protection without tenderness was just another kind of cage. The murmur that rippled through the court was like wind through dead leaves, dry, rustling, full of judgment. Several nobles exchanged glances that clearly said they thought the whole situation beneath the king's notice, that a common farmer shouldn't be allowed to waste the crown's time with domestic disputes. But then Corbin stepped forward, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. Your Majesty, if I may address the court. He didn't wait for permission, turning instead to face the assembled nobles with the confidence of a man who knew he held the winning hand. Good people of the realm, what you are witnessing is more than a simple custody dispute. What you are witnessing is the unraveling of a deception that has compromised the very integrity of our throne. The murmur grew louder, more agitated. The king's face went carefully blank, but Elara could see the fury building behind his eyes, could see him realizing that Corbin was hijacking the moment, stealing control of the narrative before the truth could be told on the king's terms. "This girl," Corbin continued, his voice rising with theatrical outrage, "is not simply some peasant child our benevolent king chose to protect. She is his daughter, his illegitimate hidden daughter, born of a liaison with a common woman, concealed from this court, from the realm, from all of us who have served the crown with loyalty and honesty." He let the words detonate, watched the shock ripple through the crowd like a physical wave. "For 18 years, our king has lied to us, has hidden this stain on the royal bloodline, has allowed us to believe him honorable while he harbored secrets that could destroy everything we've built." The throne room erupted. Voices rose in shock, anger, confusion, a cacophony of reactions ranging from genuine outrage to performative horror to barely concealed glee at the scandal unfolding. Nobles shouted over each other, demanding explanations, hurling accusations, some calling for the king to deny it, others already accepting it as truth and calculating how it might benefit their own political positions. Through it all, Thomas stood frozen, his face draining of color as the implications crashed over him. The girl he'd raised, the daughter he'd beaten for the crime of talking to a stranger. She was royalty. She was the king's child. Every strike of the whip had been an assault on royal blood. Every harsh word had been treason he hadn't known he was committing. His knees buckled, and only a guard's quick hand kept him from collapsing completely. The king rose from his throne, and his presence alone was enough to silence the chaos. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, but underneath it ran a current of something raw and honest that cut through the political theater like a blade through silk. Advisor Corbin has spoken truth, though his delivery was designed to wound rather than inform. The king's eyes swept across the court, meeting the gaze of nobles who suddenly couldn't quite hold his stare. "Yes, I have a daughter. Yes, she was born of a union with a woman not of noble blood. And yes, I have hidden her existence for 18 years. He paused, letting the admission settle like ash after a fire. "But let me tell you why." The silence was absolute, every person in that room holding their breath, waiting for justification or excuse, or some royal sleight of hand that would make the scandal disappear. But what the king offered instead was something no one expected: raw, unvarnished truth. "Because I was a coward." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. "Because when the woman I loved told me she carried my child, I chose the crown over my heart. I sent her away, told myself it was for the good of the kingdom, convinced myself that duty mattered more than love." His voice cracked, and he didn't try to hide it. "She died bringing my daughter into this world, died calling my name, and I wasn't there because I was being crowned. Because I had chosen power over the woman who'd given me the only honest thing I'd ever known." Tears streamed down his face now, visible to everyone, a display of emotion so fundamentally against every rule of royal conduct that several nobles gasped. Kings didn't cry. Kings didn't confess weakness. Kings didn't stand before their courts and admit to being human, fallible, broken by choices that had seemed necessary at the time but had rotted from within like fruit gone bad. "I gave my daughter to this man," the king gestured to Thomas, who still stood trembling, barely upright, "because I wanted her to have a life away from this." His hand swept across the court, encompassing all the political machination, all the scheming, all the poison, dressed up as civilization. Away from people who would use her as a weapon, who would see her not as a person, but as leverage, who would destroy her innocence, just to gain advantage in whatever game they were playing that week. He stepped down from the dais, and the act was so unprecedented that several guards moved instinctively forward, unsure if they should stop their king from abandoning the physical symbol of his power. But he waved them back, walking through the crowd of nobles who parted before him like wheat before wind, moving toward the side chamber where Alara waited. But I was wrong. His voice carried across the throne room even as he walked. Wrong to think I could protect her by hiding her. Wrong to believe that distance was the same as safety. Wrong to imagine that I could live with the guilt of choosing duty over love. He reached the chamber door, pulled it open, and extended his hand toward the daughter the court couldn't yet see. And so today, I choose differently. Today, I choose truth over convenience. I choose love over politics. I choose my daughter over everything else, and if that costs me my throne, then perhaps I never deserved to wear the crown in the first place." Ilara stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break her ribs. Every eye in the throne room was fixed on her, judging, assessing, calculating what her existence meant for their own positions and prospects. She could feel the weight of their stares like physical pressure, like being crushed slowly under stones. But then she looked at the king, at her father, and saw in his eyes a question, a plea, an offer of connection that transcended blood and politics and every complication that came with claiming each other publicly. He was offering her a choice. She could walk forward, step into this identity, accept the burden and blessing of being his acknowledged daughter. Or she could turn away, return to anonymity, let him bear this scandal alone. Her hand found the medallion at her throat, the moon and crown that had always been there, waiting for this moment. Her eyes moved past the king to Thomas, to the man who'd raised her with all his flaws and failures, but had still given her 18 years of life when he could have refused the burden entirely. He was weeping openly now, his weathered face crumbling with understanding and regret, and a love he'd never known how to express properly. And in that moment, Ilara understood something that perhaps no one else in that room could comprehend, that she was about to become a bridge between two worlds, two fathers, two completely different kinds of love. The question wasn't which one to choose. The question was whether she had the strength to honor both. She took the king's offered hand, and together they walked into the throne room. The throne room held its breath as Ilara stepped forward, her hand still clasped in the king's, their joined fingers a declaration that transcended words. Every face turned toward her was a study in shock, calculation, or barely concealed contempt. These nobles who'd spent their lives believing blood and breeding were what gave a person worth, now forced to confront a peasant girl who carried royal lineage they'd never known existed. The silence stretched like skin pulled too tight, ready to tear at the slightest pressure. Thomas stood rooted to the marble floor, his body shaking so violently he looked like a man in the grip of fever. His eyes, red-rimmed, wild with emotions too vast to contain, locked onto Ilara, and the sound that escaped his throat was barely human. It was the cry of a man watching his entire understanding of reality collapse, watching years of his life recontextualized in an instant from simple duty into something far more complex and terrible. "I didn't know," he choked out, the words strangling in his throat. "God is my witness, Majesty. I never knew who she was. I swear it." His legs finally gave out, knees hitting stone with a crack that echoed through the vast chamber. "I was cruel to her, beat her for nothing, shamed her in front of the village. And all that time," his voice broke completely, "all that time she was yours. She was—" He couldn't finish, couldn't find words adequate for the magnitude of his unknowing sin. Nobles shifted uncomfortably, some looking away from the raw display of peasant emotion, others leaning forward with the morbid fascination people have for tragedy unfolding before their eyes. This was better than theater, more dramatic than any carefully staged court entertainment. This was real suffering, real consequences, the kind of spectacle that would be whispered about in noble houses for years to come. But the king's attention wasn't on them. His eyes moved between Thomas and Ilara, watching his daughter's face as she stared at the man who'd raised her, trying to read in her expression whether forgiveness was even possible, whether mercy could exist in a situation this complicated, this painful, this irreparably damaged. Ilara felt like she was being torn in two, each half pulled by competing truths that couldn't coexist, but somehow had to. This man kneeling before her had caused her pain, had humiliated her, had made her childhood one of constant fear that any mistake would bring punishment. But he'd also fed her when he barely had enough food for himself, had kept a roof over her head through winters that killed others less fortunate, had taken on the burden of a child who wasn't his, given her a life when he could have left her to die on his doorstep and no one would have questioned it. "You treated me like I was worthless," she said finally, her voice quiet but carrying in the absolute silence of the room. Every word was a blade, cutting both him and herself. like I was a burden you resented having to bear, like my very existence was something shameful that needed to be beaten out of me. Thomas's head dropped lower, his forehead nearly touching the marble, his body curling in on itself as if trying to disappear. "I know," he whispered. "God help me, I know. But you also—" Ilara's voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks now, hot and bitter and cleansing all at once. "You also kept me alive. You gave me a home when you didn't have to. You could have refused the gold, refused the responsibility, left me to whatever fate awaited orphans with no one to claim them." She took a step toward him, then another, each movement feeling like walking against a current that wanted to pull her back. "You were the only father I knew, the only parent who was there when I woke from nightmares, even if you didn't know how to comfort. The only one who taught me to work, to survive, to understand that the world was harsh and unforgiving." And the king watched his daughter move toward the peasant, and something in his expression shifted, pain mixing with pride, jealousy mixing with understanding. He'd given her blood, given her life in the most literal sense, but Thomas had given her something equally important: presence, daily existence, the 1,000 small moments that built a childhood, however flawed. "I feared you," Thomas said, his voice muffled against stone, confessing to the floor what he couldn't say to her face. "From the moment they left you with me and that bag of gold coins, I feared you. You were too beautiful, even as a baby, too perfect. I knew you came from something beyond my understanding, even if I didn't know what. And as you grew—" He lifted his head slightly, finally meeting her eyes. "You were everything I wasn't. Graceful where I was rough, kind where I was harsh. And I resented it. Resented that caring for you reminded me daily of my own inadequacy." The confession was brutal in its honesty, stripping away any pretense or excuse. Around them, nobles who'd been prepared to condemn him outright found themselves uncomfortable with the naked truth of human weakness on display. It was easier to hate calculated cruelty than to confront the reality that most harm came from fear and inadequacy rather than malice. "So you hurt me," Ilara said, and it wasn't quite a question, wasn't quite an accusation. Just a statement of fact that needed to be spoken aloud, witnessed, acknowledged. "You hurt me because I made you feel small." Yes. The word was exhaled like a dying breath. "And I will carry that shame to my grave. Will wake every morning for the rest of my life knowing that I raised a hand against—" He couldn't finish, the reality too vast to articulate. Ilara stood directly before him now, this broken man who'd shaped her life in ways both terrible and necessary. She could feel the entire court watching, waiting to see what justice looked like when the victim had the power to destroy her abuser utterly. One word from her, one gesture toward the guards, and Thomas would be dragged away to whatever punishment seemed appropriate for a peasant who'd beaten royal blood. She had that power now. That terrible, seductive power to make someone else feel the helplessness she'd felt kneeling in village dirt while leather cut her skin. But instead, she did something that made half the court gasp in shock and the other half lean forward in disbelief. She knelt, lowered herself until she was eye level with Thomas, until their positions were equal, until the physical hierarchy that separated them dissolved into something more human, more complicated, more true. "I understand," she whispered, and the words were for him alone, though in the silence they carried to every corner of the room. "I understand fear. I understand inadequacy. I understand hurting people because you don't know any other way to express what's breaking inside you." Her hand moved slowly, carefully, until it rested on his shoulder. "And I understand that love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it's rough hands and harsh words and failures that pile up until you can't see past them to the care underneath." Thomas's entire body convulsed with sobs that had been building for 18 years, for every moment of regret he'd swallowed down, for every time he'd wanted to be better but didn't know how. His weathered hands came up to cover his face, but Ilara caught them, held them in her own, and the gesture was so tender, so completely unexpected given everything that had preceded it, that several nobles found themselves blinking back tears they hadn't known they were capable of shedding. The king moved then, descending from the dais completely, abandoning the physical symbol of his power to join his daughter on the floor beside the man who'd raised her. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that no crown could contain, no royal training could suppress. "I gave her to you believing you were better than me," he said to Thomas, and the admission cost him something visible, something precious. "I told myself she'd be safer with an honest farmer than with a king who'd already proven he could choose duty over love. And you know what? I was right." He paused, letting that truth settle. "You were there. You were present. You were flawed and you were human and you made mistakes, but you were there, which is more than I can say for myself." The parallel was clear, impossible to miss. Two fathers, each having failed in different ways, each carrying guilt that would never fully fade, each loving the same girl with an imperfection that was somehow more honest than any idealized version of parenthood could ever be. "Can you forgive him?" the king asked his daughter, not commanding, just asking, giving her the choice he'd never given her before. "Can you find it in yourself to see past the harm to the humanity underneath?" Alara looked between them. These two men who'd shaped her existence in ways so different, yet somehow complementary. The king who'd given her life, but abandoned her. The peasant who'd resented her, but kept her alive. Neither one was innocent. Neither one was wholly guilty. They were just men, flawed and failing and trying to navigate choices that had no clear right answers. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," she said slowly, working through the thought even as she spoke it. "It's not about pretending the harm didn't happen or that the scars don't exist. It's about—" She struggled for the words, for language adequate to express something so complex. "It's about choosing to see the whole person, not just their worst moment, but all of them. Their failures and their efforts, their cruelty and their care." She stood then, pulling Thomas up with her, and the movement was deliberate, symbolic, lifting him from the shame that had driven him to his knees. "You hurt me," she said clearly, making sure every person in that throne room heard. "You failed me in ways that left marks I'll carry forever. But you also saved me, gave me life in the only way you knew how. And if I can't forgive that, can't find grace for a man who tried and failed but tried anyway." Her voice strengthened, carrying conviction that came from somewhere deeper than logic. "Then I'm no better than everyone who would condemn me for being born to the wrong mother." The throne room erupted then, not with outrage, but with something unexpected: applause. It started small, one or two nobles whose hearts were moved despite their political calculation, then spread like wildfire through the assembly. These people who'd come expecting scandal and condemnation found themselves witnessing something rarer: redemption. Messy, complicated redemption that didn't erase the past, but found a way forward anyway. But not everyone was applauding. Advisor Corbin stood rigid, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The revelation was supposed to destroy the king's credibility, supposed to fracture the court's loyalty, supposed to create chaos he could exploit. Instead, it was creating sympathy, understanding, a narrative of human struggle and forgiveness that was far more dangerous to his ambitions than any scandal could ever be. The king saw Corbin's expression and understood instantly. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. But now he had something he hadn't had before: his daughter standing beside him, Thomas standing with them both, and a court that had just witnessed genuine emotion cut through political theater like light through darkness. He turned to Thomas, and the question he asked next made the applause die instantly, made every person lean forward to catch the words that would determine what happened next. "Could you—" The king's voice broke, then steadied. "Would you be willing to start again? Not as strangers, not as rivals, but as—" He searched for the word, for something that captured the complexity of what they were to each other now. "As family. Imperfect, damaged family trying to do better than we've done before." Thomas looked at the king, then at Alara, then back again. His face was still wet with tears, still ravaged by emotion too big for any single expression to contain. When he spoke, his voice was rough as gravel, but steady as stone. "I don't know how to be anything but what I am, Majesty. A simple man who makes mistakes more often than not." He paused, swallowed hard. "But if you're asking if I'd try, if I'd wake up every day and choose to do better, be better, love better." His eyes found Alara's, held them. Then yes. God help me, yes. The king extended his hand, not the hand of a sovereign to a subject, but the hand of one flawed father to another. Thomas stared at it for a long moment, this rough farmer looking at the smooth palm of royalty, understanding that taking it meant crossing a boundary that should have been uncrossable. Then he gripped it, calloused flesh meeting soft, and the handshake was a promise, a pact, a declaration that family was chosen as much as given. But as the court erupted in applause again, as nobles who'd come for blood found themselves moved despite their cynicism, Alara felt a wave of dizziness crash over her. The room tilted, spun, and she realized with distant alarm that she couldn't feel her legs anymore, couldn't seem to draw breath properly, couldn't. She collapsed into her father's arms, unconscious before she hit the ground, and the throne room's celebration turned instantly to panic. The world returned to Alara in fragments. First the softness beneath her, then the distant murmur of voices, then the weight of a hand holding hers with desperate gentleness. Her eyelids felt heavy as iron, but she forced them open to find two faces hovering above her, both etched with the same expression of terrified relief. The king sat on one side of her bed, Thomas on the other, and the sight of them together, these two men who should have been enemies, united only by their shared love for her, made something crack open in her chest. "Don't try to sit up," the king said quickly, his voice rough from hours of worry she could hear even if she couldn't remember. "The physician says you collapsed from exhaustion, too much emotion, too little food, too many nights without proper sleep." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, an unconscious gesture of comfort. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. 3 days. The words should have frightened her, but instead they felt distant, abstract, like something happening to someone else in a story she was only partially invested in. Her throat was dry as parchment, and when she tried to speak, only a croak emerged. Thomas was already moving, lifting a cup of water to her lips with hands that trembled so badly he nearly spilled it. She drank carefully, slowly, and the cool liquid sliding down her throat was the most real thing she'd felt since opening her eyes. "The village," Thomas said suddenly, the words bursting from him like he'd been holding them back by force of will alone. "They've been sending flowers, baskets of bread, letters." His weathered face twisted with emotion he was still learning to express. "People who watched me, who watched what I did to you, they've been leaving things at the castle gates, apologizing, saying they should have stopped me, should have spoken up, should have..." He couldn't finish, overcome by the weight of collective guilt that had apparently descended on an entire community. Alara turned her head slightly, taking in the room for the first time, and gasped. Every surface was covered with wildflowers, daisies, bluebells, clover, the simple blooms that grew in fields worked by people with dirt under their fingernails and hope in their hearts despite everything. They filled the air with a scent that reminded her of childhood before it turned complicated, of running through meadows before she learned that beauty could be dangerous, that being noticed could bring punishment. "They remember who you were," the king said softly, following her gaze. "The girl who helped old Margaret with her garden when her hands got too gnarled to work properly, who sang to children to help them forget their hunger, who gave away her own bread when someone else's need seemed greater." His voice carried a pride mixed with sorrow. "You were kind in a world that gave you every reason not to be. And they see that now. See what they almost destroyed by standing silent while cruelty masqueraded as righteousness." Through the open window, Alara could hear something unexpected. Music, laughter, the sounds of celebration drifting up from the castle grounds. Her eyebrows drew together in confusion, and the king's face softened into something approaching a smile, though sadness still clung to its edges. "The decree," he said. "I announced it the day you collapsed, had it read in every village, every town, every corner of the kingdom." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words carefully, understanding their weight. "No person shall be judged by the circumstances of their birth. Noble blood does not grant automatic virtue, and common blood does not imply automatic vice. Worth will be measured by character, by action, by the content of one's heart, rather than the accident of one's ancestry." The words hung in the air, revolutionary in their simplicity, world-changing in their implication. Alara tried to process what he was saying, that her existence, her revelation, her very presence as living proof that royalty and common folk shared the same capacity for love and loss and everything in between, had somehow sparked a fundamental shift in how the kingdom defined value. "People are celebrating," Thomas added, his voice carrying a wonder that suggested he still couldn't quite believe it. "Across the realm, they're saying," he swallowed hard, "they're saying if a king can acknowledge his mistakes, can choose love over pride, can see worth in a peasant daughter, then maybe there's hope for all of us. Maybe we don't have to be trapped by the stations we were born into. Maybe change is possible." But Alara's attention had snagged on something else, something Thomas had said earlier. "Letters?" she whispered, her voice still weak but growing stronger. "From the village?" Thomas reached behind him, producing a bundle of parchment tied with rough twine. The expensive paper clearly donated by someone with means, but the handwriting on the visible portions crude, unpracticed, the work of people who rarely had reason to write anything down. "Hundreds of them," he said, placing the bundle carefully on the bed beside her. "People you grew up with, people who knew you, all saying," his voice broke, "all saying they're sorry, that they wish they'd been braver, that they see you now for what you always were, someone worth protecting instead of punishing." Alara's fingers trembled as they touched the bundle, feeling the weight of collective regret and hope pressed into paper. These were people she'd shared her childhood with, who'd watched her grow from a confused child into a woman who never quite fit the space she'd been forced to occupy. And now they were reaching across the distance that separated them, offering something more valuable than gold: acknowledgement of their own failures, recognition of her humanity, proof that people could change when confronted with the consequences of their silence. The king stood then, moving to the window, his silhouette framed against afternoon light that painted him in shades of gold and amber. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 3 days thinking about mortality, about legacy, about what actually mattered when everything else was stripped away. "I've been king for 23 years, he said to the window, to the kingdom beyond, to himself. Ruled through wars and famines, through political intrigue and assassination attempts, through everything the crown demanded I survive. And in all that time, I thought I was doing what was necessary, what was right." He turned back to face them, and his face was open in a way kings' faces never were, vulnerable, honest, human. "But the truth is, I was just a coward hiding behind duty, using responsibility as an excuse for emotional avoidance." "You were protecting the kingdom," Alara said softly, surprised to find herself defending him, defending the choices that had stolen her childhood from her. "Was I?" The question was genuine, searching. "Or was I protecting myself from having to feel things that were uncomfortable? From having to choose between competing goods instead of easy calculations of political advantage?" He moved back to the bedside, sitting again, this time looking at both Thomas and Alara with equal intensity. "What I've learned these past weeks, what you've taught me, is that real strength isn't about making the hard choices everyone expects. It's about making the impossible choices no one thinks you're capable of. It's about admitting you were wrong and choosing differently going forward, even when that admission costs you everything you've built." Thomas cleared his throat, and both of them turned to him. The peasant looked uncomfortable with the attention, his rough hands twisting in his lap, but he spoke anyway, forcing words past years of conditioning that said people like him shouldn't speak truth to power. "When they brought you to me," he said to Alara, his eyes fixed on his hands rather than her face, "wrapped in fine cloth with that bag of gold coins, I knew you were trouble, knew you were going to complicate my simple life. But I took you anyway, and not just for the money." He finally looked up, met her eyes. "Part of me wanted to believe that if I could raise you right, could protect you and provide for you, could make you into someone good despite your mysterious origins, then maybe I wasn't as worthless as I'd always felt. Maybe I could be more than just a man who pushed a plow and died forgotten." The confession was raw, unpolished, but it carried a truth that resonated deeper than any practiced speech. Alara felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but these were different from the ones she'd cried before. Not tears of grief or pain, but of understanding finally reaching places that had been locked in darkness. "You gave me life," she said to the king, her voice strengthening with conviction. "But he taught me how to live." She turned to Thomas. "You showed me that survival requires toughness, that the world doesn't care about fairness, that sometimes you have to endure things that aren't right just to make it to tomorrow." Then back to the king. "And you showed me that power without heart is just cruelty and expensive clothes. That being able to do something doesn't mean you should. That the crown is only as valuable as the character of the person wearing it." She pushed herself up slowly, ignoring their protests, needing to be sitting for what she wanted to say next. "I don't forgive either of you because you deserve it. I forgive you because holding on to the anger would destroy me more than it would hurt you. Because carrying that weight would make me into someone I don't want to be." She looked between them, these two flawed men who'd shaped her in ways both terrible and necessary. "And because if there's one thing this whole nightmare has taught me, it's that people are complicated. We hurt each other while trying to protect each other. We fail each other while genuinely trying to love each other. And if we can't find grace for that, if we can't accept that good people sometimes do terrible things for reasons that seemed right at the time, then there's no hope for any of us." The words settled into the room like light through stained glass, transforming everything they touched. Thomas was crying openly now, tears carving clean tracks through weathered skin. The king's composure had crumbled completely, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd probably been holding back for 3 days of watching his daughter unconscious, not knowing if she'd wake up, not knowing if he'd lost his second chance before he'd even really claimed it. But Ilara felt something else rising in her, not quite joy, not quite peace, but something close to both, a settling, an acceptance, the understanding that her life would always be complicated, would always exist at the intersection of worlds that weren't meant to touch, but that complication didn't have to be a curse. It could be a bridge, a way of connecting things that needed connecting, of proving that the boundaries people drew between each other were more imaginary than real. "There's something you should know," the king said, wiping his face with the back of his hand in a gesture so unregal it made him seem decades younger. "The court, after you collapsed, after they saw 2 fathers and a daughter choosing love over pride, choosing honesty over convenient lies, something shifted. Nobles who'd been whispering about scandal started talking about courage instead, about what it means to be worthy of power." He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "You changed more than just our family. You changed how the kingdom sees itself." Through the window, the celebration continued, music and laughter rising on evening air, the sound of a people discovering that hope was possible even after everything that had tried to kill it. And in that room, surrounded by wildflowers sent by people who'd learned to be better, 3 broken people held on to each other and chose to believe that starting over was always possible, that redemption was real, that love, messy, complicated, imperfect love, was stronger than every force that tried to destroy it. The sun set over the kingdom in shades of purple and gold, painting the sky in colors that seemed designed for new beginnings. And in a castle that had witnessed 1,000 endings, 3 people who shouldn't have belonged together created something unexpected. A family forged not from perfection, but from the courage to fail and try again anyway. The story could have ended there, with reconciliation and hope and the kind of neat resolution that satisfied every expectation. But life was never that simple. And the most important lessons Ilara was learning came not from the moments when everything worked out perfectly, but from the messy, ongoing work of choosing love day after day, even when it was hard, even when it hurt, even when the easier path was always visible just out of reach. Outside, the kingdom celebrated. Inside, 3 hearts beat in fragile synchronization, learning the rhythm of a grace that had to be practiced rather than perfected, that would require daily recommitment for the rest of their lives. The love that saves isn't the love that arrives with trumpets and certainty. It's the love that shows up imperfect and stays anyway, that chooses presence over perfection, that understands forgiveness as a journey rather than a destination. And as night fell over the castle, as candles were lit in windows across the realm, as people who'd felt trapped by the circumstances of their birth dared to imagine different futures. One truth became clear. The most powerful force in any kingdom isn't the strength of its armies or the wealth in its coffers. It's the courage of ordinary people choosing extraordinary grace, one impossible decision at a time. In the end, this story asks us the questions we're most afraid to answer. Would you have the courage to forgive someone who hurt you while claiming to protect you? Could you choose truth over comfort, knowing it might destroy everything you've built? When faced with the choice between duty and love, between what's expected and what's right, which path would you take? Ilara's journey reminds us that the heaviest chains aren't the ones others put on us. They're the ones we forge ourselves from. Fear, pride, and the belief that some mistakes are too big to be forgiven. True strength isn't found in perfection or power. It's found in the trembling voice that speaks truth anyway, in the broken heart that chooses to love again, in the courage to be vulnerable when every instinct screams for protection. The king wore a crown, but it was his tears that proved he was worthy of it. Thomas had calloused hands, but it was his willingness to change that showed his real strength. And Ilara, caught between two worlds, discovered that bridges are built not from certainty, but from the brave choice to connect what seems impossible to reconcile. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people you need to forgive, or the truths you've been too afraid to speak, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear that redemption is real, that change is possible, that love, messy, complicated, imperfect love, is always worth fighting for. Subscribe to join us for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of our shared humanity. Like this video if you believe in second chances, and leave a comment telling us, what would you have done in Ilara's place? Your story matters, and we'd love to hear it.